Hello there, my name is Sixo, but more on that later because I'm here to double down on something. This is not the Cartoon Colours Missing Link Arcee. Well, okay, technically it is cartoon colours because it's pink and white, so if you want it to work as that, then that's perfectly fine. It does a generally good job at that, even if it's not 100% accurate. But my point is more that I don't believe that's what Takara Tomy intended for this C08 release, and I'm gonna go one further. I think they see this one as the Toy Colours release, not this one, the C07, which is very distinctly the prototype colours, whereas this one is the kind of toy that we never got back in 1986. Confused yet? Well, I kind of said some of this in my recent review of these toys and laid out a few of the reasons why I think that's the case, and it created some interesting debate, so I thought why not get a little bit more into it today, and I'm going to start with a statement that I feel is sure to ruffle a few feathers. I don't believe the orange and pink prototype colours are what we would have seen in production back in 1986. As in, I don't think that's what would have actually been released had they made an Arcee toy at the time beyond that initial prototype. Now, I can understand why people think it would have been. I mean, after all, these are the only colours we know of in toy form from the time, as we've all seen the photos of the prototype ever since it first emerged in the late 90s. But here's the thing, that particular model is a very early hand-sculpted prototype, and not necessarily indicative of what a hypothetical Arcee toy would have looked like by the time it made it to retail production. For one thing, the model seen here cannot transform, and the engineering required for it to do so seemingly had not been designed yet. Now, Takara Tomy themselves said as much when they first announced that a Missing Link Arcee might happen, stating that the new design was just a mock-up based on that original prototype and the transformation mechanism was yet to be worked on. This was incredibly common back in the 80s, with mock-ups often made in wood or various other handcrafted materials as a kind of statement of intent for what the particular toy might eventually look like, before Takara designers would then get in and actually work out all the kinks, like how it would move between modes. In Arcee's case, the vintage prototype was made of foam, and you can see it doesn't have the wheels on the shoulders, the sides of the car on the arms, or the peg holes on areas such as the thighs, all because it wasn't a working model yet, and not really a true sign of what the final product would actually look like. Again, more a statement of intent than anything, and one that would have been worked on for many more stages of production had that process been allowed to continue at the time. Now, it's fun to think that Arcee might have kept her orange and pink hues all the way to retail, but I just don't see that happening, especially not when most of her contemporaries all received colour schemes which were largely in line with what we saw on screen, bar a couple of obvious exceptions, which we'll get to. It was also not at all unusual for the toys at the time to go through very obvious colour scheme changes during production. Now, you only have to look at the 1986 pre-Toy Fair catalogue to see examples which vary quite a bit from what we actually saw on shelves back in the day, including movie and non-movie characters alike. Many of the examples you see here are also non-transformable hand-painted models, though seemingly much further down the design process and closer to what was soon released, with many of these very figures also appearing in the 1986 catalogues that accompanied the toys. In the case of the movie cast, a lot of these changes occurred because the toys were being designed almost in tandem with the animation models. So as the movie designs were being tweaked and updated, so too were the toy designers evolving their work to try and match that, in an effort to have the final thing not look too different at least. It's worth noting here that the toys were rarely one-to-one though, and if anything, they still often represented a kind of unfinished character model of some kind, instead of being wholly accurate to the actual finished thing we saw on screen. The exceptions people will no doubt cite here are Hot Rod and Galvatron, with the former having been released in a distinctly more dark red kind of burgundy hue instead of the eye-popping pink seen on screen. That's a bit different though, as we already know that Hot Rod did have a much more accurate toy in production all the way up to it being a final transformable model, before Hasbro and Takara simply wimped out on the idea of releasing a pink toy in what they largely perceived to be a boys' toy line in the 1980s, which, unsurprisingly, is the same logic that meant we never got an Arcee toy back in the day. As for Galvatron, his classic 1986 toy debuted in a more uniform grey versus the purple of the movie, again suggesting that it was based on an earlier version of the cartoon model. Whilst in this case, yes, that outdated colour scheme did make it all the way through to toy production, it also feels like a kind of unique situation given that we saw those same colours featured in the Marvel comics of the time, as well as plenty of supporting movie merch besides. By comparison, Arcee's orange hues are nowhere to be seen in finalised media, meaning that we can likely conclude they were abandoned much earlier during the movie's development process, and a hypothetical 1986 toy would likely have followed that lead. Now, interestingly, in Arcee's case, she actually had two distinct attempts at creating her animation model, and whilst you may think they're largely the same, there are some noticeable differences, including the wheel arches on her shoulders being moved towards her backpack for the final result, and the overall silhouette being made more slender and human-like. It's that first character model which influenced the classic early toy prototype, of course, with the shapes and details all broadly the same, although it has also been used as reference for some media as well, most notably her depiction in the 1980s Marvel Comics. What's even more telling is that an early colour scheme for this first animation model was unearthed back in 2010, showing that the original plan was for the movie character to be a much more uniform pink with some obvious orange highlights, which is clearly where the slightly unusual colour scheme for that same prototype must have initially come from. It's not one-to-one by any means, but certainly a number of the details do line up, and it's evident that her colour scheme was still being worked on at this early point in movie and toy production. Now, there is a later version of the same cartoon model before it was drastically reworked to the more familiar shape seen in the movie, and here we can see the expected hues of pink and white similar to what we actually got on screen, except it's still not 100% there, because you'll note she has pink ears, a grey collar, a wholly grey midriff, and some grey shading on the shoulders. It's worth mentioning that this colour scheme did actually crop up in finished animation in the Season 3 episode Only Human, where you can see that Arcee looks distinctly different from how we usually think of her. In any case, it's this version which is seemingly the inspiration for the pink and white Missing Link Arcee figure, as you'll note those same deco choices are all carried over in some fashion, setting it at least somewhat apart from the final animation model seen in the finished 1986 film, and meaning this isn't, strictly speaking, a straightforward anime-accurate take. It seems so oddly specific that Takara Tomy would do this too, because if they wanted the new figure to be anime-accurate, they surely would just do that and go the whole hog, not base it on this discarded earlier model. It is also, by the way, why the two Missing Link toys have different head sculpts, with the C07 version being modelled after the prototype, which in turn resembles that earlier animation model, and the more angular face and helmet, and the C08 figure featuring a more humanoid-style noggin, akin to what we see on the later cartoon design. For my money, the C08 sculpt also feels more in keeping with the slightly curved facial features of 1986 toys like Cup, while still being somewhat distinct from how these characters were portrayed on screen in the movie. Compare this to something like the anime version of Missing Link Bumblebee, and you'll see that that toy is distinctly more slavish when it comes to recreating the character's animated likeness, making this Arcee sculpt feel like a definite attempt to kind of craft a fitting vintage toy-style take on her own cartoon appearance. Anyway, that all leads me to thinking that the Missing Link team has also decided that Arcee's colours would have likely evolved beyond the initial orange and pink of the early prototype, had the toy continued being worked on in the 80s. And in keeping with many of the other toys of the time, it quite possibly would have looked like an almost final but not 100% slavish version of what we actually saw on screen. Think of it this way, C07 is distinctly a homage to the original prototype and its very early colour scheme, while C08 is like the toy that we never got at the time, but probably might have? At least I think that's how Takara Tomy sees it, and again, that's not me saying the orange and pink one can't work on a shelf with classic 1986 toys, because it does, nor that the pink and white one can't work as some sort of anime version, because let's be fair, it also does. For me, this is more about defining Takara's intent in the case of Missing Link, and I think once you further consider that they included a toy-style character card in the package with C08, similar to the same style of card we also saw with the toy-styled C01 Convoy or C05 Sunstreaker, it becomes clear that yes, they see the pink and white Arcee as a toy-styled endeavour. By comparison, the prototype colours release has a pink card with blue lines, similar to what we saw with the anime C02 Convoy, so I think that's Takara's way of saying this is an unusually styled release separate from the kind of regular toy line in a way. To be fair, even the boxes themselves distinguish C07 as being the Arcee prototype quite specifically, whereas C08 is just listed as Arcee with no qualifier of any kind. Now, if we look at the C02 release of Convoy, we can see that the box identifies that as the anime edition right there on the front, so it seems at least slightly logical that Takara Tomy would have been consistent here if they viewed C08 Arcee as a cartoon colours version. Now, for complete transparency, they did use this description in the initial promotional blurb of the Missing Link Arcee toys, but from what I can see, it doesn't feature anywhere on the packaging of the toy itself, and given everything else we've looked at already, I'm kind of happy to write it off as a slight inconsistency in what otherwise to me seems to be a fairly uniform message. Besides, that same promo photography also features the pink and white toy sporting the optional stickers included in the box, as does the box art featured on the packaging of the toy itself. In fact, Takara were again very consistent in this approach, typically showcasing the C07 version without stickers to bring it closer in line with the classic 80s prototype, and conversely keeping the stickers represented on the C08 release. In that same way, those stickers make the pink and white Missing Link Arcee feel entirely in keeping with the vintage 1986 movie toys, in that they often have colour schemes which are broadly accurate to the screen, but far from slavishly so, and they have additional embellishments provided through the use of sticker details not found on the animation models. All of this was enough for me to conclude that for my tastes and what I wanted in my collection, stickering up the C08 release was absolutely the right way to go, adding those little extra touches that take it from being a quasi-anime style product to something which feels wholly in keeping with the toys that were released back in the 80s, representing Arcee on my G1 shelves in a manner which to me feels authentic to what I personally believe might have actually happened at the time. It means she blends perfectly with the likes of Hot Rod, Cut, Blur and the rest, and corrects a 39-year-old mistake in giving her a suitably styled toy at long last. A true Missing Link in its way. The C07 version meanwhile stands out as a homage to that early prototype so many of us have admired through computer screens all these years, bringing it to life as a fitting accompaniment to the production toy we rightly should have had back in 1986. And again, I caveat all of this by saying that if you want to mix it up and have the prototype version on a G1 vintage toy shelf, or you consider the pink and white take as anime colours, that's not a wrong thing to do by any means, and I would never dare to suggest otherwise. But for me, this just feels right somehow, and frankly, I couldn't be more excited to see it all happen at long last. Anyway, I'd really appreciate it if you could drop me a like for today's effort, please, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, but otherwise, that's it from me. So have a great rest of your day, and TTFN.